Hello, and welcome to our newest series of Business and Decision web seminars. The aim of these seminars is to provide some very plain guidance on regulatory issues at a relatively fundamental level. The areas we're going to cover are life sciences covering all countries, HIPAA, and Sarbanes-Oxley, which will be of most interest to companies trading in the U.S., and some related areas of general interest in regulatory compliance. We're going to cover some of the basic principles of regulatory compliance, assuming no previous knowledge on behalf of the listener, and they're likely to be of interest to companies or people who are new to the life sciences industry or new to HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley, or just who want to get to the basic information of why compliance is needed. Most of these webcasts will be short and recorded to complement the existing series of B&D Life Sciences webinars, and each webinar will be accompanied by an information sheet on the same subject and linked to a web page on the B&D website. Just because these broadcasts are recorded doesn't mean that you can't ask questions, and in fact, the reason we're here today is to answer the questions that have been submitted based on the previously recorded webcasts. Just send your question to the email address at the bottom of every page, and it will come to somebody on the presenting team. We promise that we will answer every question that we get, whether it be on a future webcast or at the very least on our Life Sciences blog and webpage. My name is Ashley Peacock. I'm the Director of Regulatory Compliance for Business and Decision North America. I've worked in the regulated industries for a little over 15 years now, with a decade of them dedicated to life sciences. I have extensive experience in quality management and IS compliance. And along with my counterpart, Dave Hawley, I'm directly responsible for the delivery of IS compliance services within the North American market. I'm also a certified HIPAA professional, so I'm very well versed in applying privacy and security controls across a very wide set of standards and regulations. Guy Wakefield has had some technical issues, but will hopefully be joining us soon. Guy is one of our principals, also in the life sciences practice. He's directed and executed a very broad portfolio of compliance initiatives serving pharmaceutical, medical device, and biotech sectors, including several under consent decree and with corporate integrity agreements. His expertise includes development of global strategies for IT compliance, computer systems validation and planning, 21 CFR Part 11 initiatives, and regulatory inspection of mission-critical business, laboratory, clinical, and quality control systems.
Hey, Ashley, I'm here. Thanks.
You're welcome. I will hand it over to you.
All right. Again, thank you for those on the call and attending this webcast. And thank you, Ashley, for participating today. Our agenda is pretty simple. We will briefly summarize the recorded webcast by discussing key regulations impacting information systems and the IT personnel that support them. And we'll also talk about who needs to comply with these regulations. We'll also spend most of our time answering questions that were submitted when you registered or on the web page linked at the previous recorded webcasts. Speaking of questions, if you do not have any questions submitted just yet, please feel free to do so at any time during this webcast. You can ask a question at any time by pressing the Ask Question button and by typing your question in the pop-up box. I will correlate the questions as we go through the webcast, and then we'll answer them in the Q&A session at the end. If we do run out of time to address your live questions, we'll make sure that we post the answers on our Life Science blog, which we'll remind you about later. We should also tell you that this session is being recorded and will be available after the event, along with copies of the slides. You or your colleagues can watch the recording or download the slides from the Business and Decision Life Science and Healthcare website, where we now have a library of 50 life science webcasts covering a wide variety of topics. As usual, we will be sending you a link to today's event, which will allow you to download a copy of the slides. At the end of the session, we'll also ask for your comments, feedback, and ratings. which you can provide by pressing the Rate This button. We will remind you at the end of today's session. So, Ashley, let me hand it back over to you, and you can continue the discussion.
Okay. So there are three major sets of regulations that frequently impact IP departments. The first are around the life sciences. If you're in the U.S., those are the FDA regulations. The UK, it's MHRA. The rest of the EU, it's EMEA. But every country has its own set of expectations. In India, you have the Central Drug Standard Control Office. You have Ministry of Health and Family, SFDA in China. Regardless of where you are operating, there is a GXP expectation. Collectively, we refer to them as the GXPs. There's also 21 CFR Part 11, which deals very specifically with the electronic nature of those records, and 820 is the Quality Systems Regulation. Basically, what they're all seeking to do is to ensure that our food and drug products are safe and effective for the public. And that includes ensuring that the computer systems which could potentially affect the safety or efficacy are implemented correctly and maintain a state of control. The next major body of regulations is HIPAA. That's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which came about to improve the portability and continuity of health insurance coverage and really to combat waste and abuse in the healthcare industry and in health insurance. In order to do that, the government gave some very significant motivators, largely financial, to get companies to move to electronic records. The health industry, life sciences as well, has typically been very slow in adopting technology, and it was recognized that they needed some incentives. But with that, health information is very, very sensitive. It's very personal. And there was a lot of public fear, a lot of it very justified, most of it very justified, what would happen when this personal information was stored electronically. So as part of HIPAA, there was a great deal of detail placed around how IT systems would be used and maintained and what controls needed to be in place to make sure that data was kept safe and private. So it looks at things that we also see in life sciences and Sarbanes-Oxley about making sure that your data is good and accurate, but it also looks in a great deal of detail about making sure that your data is secure and making sure that it's private. So looking at things like internal threats, can the right person get to the right data, and also external threats, so firewalls and security, virus protection, etc. And the third major regulation that impacts IT is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which looks at the financial data. Again, it deals very specifically with the accuracy of your data, and much like HIPAA, it also looks at the security around your data, making sure that data cannot be corrupted, making sure that data cannot be lost. Sarbanes-Oxley also deals a lot with the process around how that data was created. So it talks in a great deal about who can access data and the roles and responsibilities. One of the things that's very specific in Sarbanes-Oxley is that not only are companies accountable for the financial data, the individuals who touch that data are also responsible. So it talks about making sure that process exists and checking that process is effective, and also if that process is electronic, which for large companies which are publicly traded, generally that information is electronic, that your computer systems are set up to enforce those processes and to detect any issues with those processes or breaches to that process. So who needs to comply with these regulations? Depending on the regulation, that may be a very simple question or it may be a more complicated question. If your company produces or distributes goods that are used as medication or medical devices, it's subject to GXP regulation, whatever the regulation is in the country where that's sold, which is a very critical point. It's not the country where it's made, it is the country where it is sold. Sometimes those are the same and sometimes those are different. Now, whether that product be a pharmaceutical that is prescription, over-the-counter, it doesn't particularly matter. There's a little bit more rigor around things that are prescription versus non-prescription, or things like blood, but it is, again, just the rigor that the process, and particularly for IT, there's not a lot of variability in the IT process. The functional requirements may be different. The scrutiny of your testing may be different just because your risk will be higher for something like a prescription injectable versus a food supplement. One other thing to note here in life sciences, it's not necessarily just people that make the end product. If you make something that goes into a pharmaceutical, an API, you're subject to the same rules for finished product, although again, you're going to have a little bit lower risk. And depending on also what you manufacture that may go into that product, if you have a non-active excipient, it's generally treated, again, with the same regulations at a lower level of rigor. Medical device companies. I call this out. They were mentioned on the previous slide, and they're generally governed under the same set of regulations and the same regulating bodies as pharmaceuticals. But the one thing that is a little bit different if you're operating in an international environment is how the medical device is regulated. With pharmaceuticals, we see that while there is a separate regulation in every country, they're typically pretty standard. Whereas medical devices, it's not always the case. And where this varies mostly is in how medical devices are classified. In the United States, we have 3 classes of medical devices, and as things become kind of closer and closer to the patient or higher risk, they move up in class. So something that is a class 1 in the United States may or may not be a class 1 in Canada. Canada actually has 4 classes, and Australia has 5. And where that becomes important to you as an IT department is because that does directly impact the risk, and because for medical devices, the software is considered oftentimes a very integral part of that device. You need to know what that level of risk is. Also, depending on what kind of company you are, if you're a blood company, your software itself may be considered a medical device. So HIPAA, who needs to be compliant with HIPAA? HIPAA tends to impact a much broader range of different types of companies. Basically what it comes down to is any company that has access to, uses, modifies, changes, stores PHI. PHI is protected health information. Protected health information is something that obviously has health information, but also is identifiable to that individual. So if I have a big bank of clinical trial information that has no identifying information for a patient, that's not going to fall under HIPAA. If I have, if I'm not necessarily in a healthcare environment, if I just have, for example, if I'm a credit card company, I have a lot of very sensitive personal information that's identifiable. There are regulations that are required there for that privacy, but it's not HIPAA because it is not health related. Now, one of the things that is a little bit different between HIPAA and what we've seen traditionally in the life sciences is kind of where that onus for compliance is. HIPAA requires that any company working with the data is responsible for that data, as are the individuals. So where this comes into play many, many times for IT departments is if you have either outsourced, hired a consultant, have a partner that is maintaining your computer systems, those companies are also responsible for HIPAA compliance. And you are responsible as of this year for actually having a legal contract in place that says, this is my business associate, the BA. So I have an agreement with my BA that says they will comply with HIPAA, they're going to follow my standards, they have the same controls in place. And basically what that's looking to do is to make sure that there aren't, any gaps in the security and safety of that data. So it's very easy if you're a large company and you have outsourced your medical billing, and you as a hospital say, I have great controls here, I'm not responsible for what happens over there. What the Department of Health and Human Services has said is, A, you are responsible for the actions of the companies that you have employed, but also those companies that you've employed, so in this example, your insurance billing partner is also responsible for their actions and their employees' actions. Sarbanes-Oxley, who needs to comply here? This is one where it becomes a much more cut and dry question. First of all, are you in the U.S. and are you publicly traded? If the answer to that is yes, then you must comply with Sarbanes-Oxley, and if the answer to that is no, then you do not have to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley. Be a little careful with that answer, because chances are very good that if you are operating as a publicly traded company in another country, that you have a similar regulation there. But in terms of Sarbanes-Oxley, publicly traded in the U.S. So within that, though, obviously companies tend to be particularly publicly traded companies tend to be very large. So kind of who within the organization is responsible, and really it's anybody that has financial data, and financial data comes in a lot of different forms. The general ledger is very obvious. Sarbanes-Oxley is dealing with reportings that we file to the SEC, IRS, et cetera. And so anything that's going to go directly into those reportings, but you also need to look a little further downstream as to the information that's going to go into those reports. So things like purchasing, receiving, inventory, anywhere that we're dealing with financial transactions. And this is actually an area where a lot of times you're going to find that there is some overlap between your GXP requirements and your Sarbanes-Oxley requirements, particularly around product costing. If you are in a process manufacturing environment, which most pharmaceutical companies are, there tend to be a lot of overlapping requirements as to when is a product done, when does it become something of value, how do we cost that product. And so this is an area where you tend to have, you tend to need your financial compliance officer and your GXP compliance representatives, usually call them QA on that side, need to both be involved in working together. The other thing you want to look out for in Sarbanes-Oxley is systems that are maintaining HR data. One of the things that Sarbanes-Oxley tells us is that you need to have processes in place, and you need to have very clear, defined roles and responsibilities for individuals, so that it's very clear who is responsible for approving financial transactions, who can purchase, who can't. And so if you have that automated, which generally we do, the systems that are kind of driving that, so who has your HR record, because that HR record tells me, this person is the director of purchasing, and therefore they can approve this, or this person is on the shop floor, and so they can do, completions in a manufacturing batch. So I'm going to hand it back over to Guy, and we're going to talk through some of the questions that were submitted previously.
Thanks, Ashley. So the first question, what is PIC-S? PIC-S stands for Pharmaceutical Inspection Convention and Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Schema. There are 44 participating agencies, including the FDA, MHRA, and the equivalent regulatory bodies for many other countries. The goal for PIC-S was to provide a harmonized framework for inspecting GMP facilities around the world. Their focus is primarily on supporting processes like cleaning and quality control, and they did release guidance in 2007 on the use of computer systems in GXP environments. And we included the link to their website above if you'd like to download it. The guide is a few years old, so it doesn't take into advantage some of the more recent industry norms around risk or risk management, but it does specifically reference and it recommends the use of GAMP. If your company is operating globally, it's definitely worth taking a quick look at for guidance. But if you're looking to establish a validation system for the very first time, you'll probably be better served by using the GAMP guide. Ashley, you want to take some questions? Sure.
So does the FDA require me to upgrade from GAMP 4 to GAMP 5? So first of all, the FDA doesn't require you to use either. It's recommended. It's an industry norm, and I think it's kind of to your benefit to use it. It's certainly a very useful tool in implementing FDA regulation and global GXP regulations. Now, in terms of moving from GAMP4 to GAMP5, GAMP4 was a great tool at the time. It doesn't utilize a lot of risk management. That was kind of one of the major changes between GAMP4 and GAMP5 is that it is much more risk-based, so it's much more in line with current regulation, current regulatory guidance, I should say. The regulations themselves haven't changed, and current industry norm. In terms of upgrading, I would absolutely, obviously, recommend that you do, but I would be careful that you don't go back and kind of redo things that were done under GAMP4. So what you want to do is look at, somewhere that we're going to draw a line in the sand and say, from here forward, we're going to validate using the principles of GAMP5, and we will use the principles of GAMP5 to do our change controls. But there's nothing that requires you to use either or to make a move from one to the other than I think that you will find making that move will be more cost effective and you will have increased compliance. So it's kind of a win-win. Next question was, what are the HIPAA requirements for systems that maintain clinical trial data? So this is a question that comes up a lot, and it varies a lot with your system, so I'm not going to have a great straightforward answer here. So the thing to remember with HIPAA is that HIPAA only applies if that information could potentially be utilized for a payment transaction. Now, that does not necessarily mean that you are getting paid for that transaction. A lot of times what that means is this something that could prevent somebody from getting health insurance in the future? So if you were doing a clinical trial on a fatal disease, I tend to use cancer as my example because it's one that people know, that could potentially impact somebody's ability to get insurance or to receive payment. And so that brings it into the realm of, potentially into the realm of requiring HIPAA compliance. Now, as for what the HIPAA requirements are, the HIPAA requirements don't change based on whether it's a clinical system or it's a system, for actual patients in a hospital. The requirements are the requirements. You have to make sure that your data is valid. You have to make sure that only people that should be accessing it are accessing it. And you have to make sure that it's maintained and accessible. Next one, I suspect the same person. Does a system that maintains data for clinical trials need to be SOX compliant? Again, it's going to vary a lot depending on what your system is used for. If it is a system that has financial impact, then you do need to maintain SOX compliance. And for clinical trial systems, oftentimes the answer to that is yes, and oftentimes the answer to that is no. If I have a clinical trial system that is purely maintaining clinical trial information, so it's patient information and dosages and adverse event reporting, then there's no SOX impact to that. But oftentimes with a clinical trial system, there's more information that's being maintained. Oftentimes there are financial compensations that are being made either to help cover patient expenses, to cover doctor expenses. If you are maintaining any of the financial information on how you are distributing those drugs, then it does bring it into the realm of SOX compliance. The good thing on this, though, is from an IT perspective, if you are required to have regulatory compliance for a GXP, then the incremental change for SOX compliance is generally none. With all of these regulations, and this kind of comes up over and over again, is that regulatory compliance is enforcing good business practices, and it's requiring you to document them. So if you have a clinical system that also has financial information, you might have some tweaks to your documentation. You're probably going to need to pull in an extra person or two because now you have your financial compliance officer and not just your quality assurance department. But it shouldn't really change your strategy for validating that system and maintaining that system.
I think I shot the next question, Ashley.
Okay.
So what's the difference between validating a GMP system and a GLP system? The requirements around computer system validation are really the same regardless of what GXP regulation they fall under. You're still going to need a plan and user requirements and verification that those requirements were met, where you're going to start to see some differences is in the level of risk and potential, the rigor of testing. Generally, a GLP system, one that is not dealing with human subjects, is going to be lower risk than a GMP or a GCP system where there's potentially direct impact to human safety. The other area where you might see some potentially lower risk in GLP is around confidentiality, where a good clinical practice system might have significant risk around patient data and things like social security numbers, identifying information for animals. It's probably going to be a lower risk. But again, the process for validating FDA-regulated systems doesn't vary regardless of which GXP it is. The only thing that is going to change is the level of risk assessed and potentially your rigor of the verification. The next question, where are electronic signatures required? So electronic signatures are never required by the FDA. Their documentation, 21 CFR Part 11, it gives you the option of using electronic signatures in place of paper signatures, and then it gives you some detail around what is required when you do opt to use electronic signatures. As for when a signature is required, that's determined largely around your internal procedures. The predicate rules themselves have very few requirements for actual signatures, but we'd encourage you to work with your internal quality assurance department around where a signature is required. Just be careful not to confuse approvals with signatures. Just because something requires a review or an acknowledgement doesn't mean it necessarily requires a full signature. If there's a specific function where you're questioning if a signature is required, then feel free to submit a question on that, but a handwritten signature is always an option. That being said, if you're using an electronic system, I would not recommend using a handwritten system. It becomes very difficult to link handwritten signatures to the electronic signatures or electronic records, and this is an area where we've seen some FDA scrutiny. So we'll now take another look at the questions that were submitted during today's webcast. Again, for those of you, please feel free to continue to submit questions using the Ask Question button. I can use let's see what we've got here.
Did we lose you guys?
Yep, I'm still here. Just looking at some of these questions. So one of the questions that came up, can I use the same validation SOPs for Sarbanes-Oxley and HIPAA compliance? So yes, you can use the same procedures, and that is the approach we would recommend for any validation, regardless of the regulations involved. The validation process should remain the same. And with those two particular regulations, you're going to find a lot of overlap because of the focus on data protection and security. What you are going to want to look at is who needs to be involved from a user and compliance base. Those are generally different groups for SOX-related functionality and HIPAA-related functionality, and relative risk of the requirements. So, next question. Can I have a vendor perform my IQ and can they perform a UAT? So it's actually two questions. So let me go about this way. Yes, an IQ is a great place to take advantage for your vendor's expertise. One of the things that GAMP 5 emphasizes is the use of vendors. For you, the installation is generally a one-time thing with a new system. You don't know that very well, so it's very pragmatic from a risk perspective, and it's very cost-effective to utilize a vendor IQ. Obviously, the vendor has many installations and knows the system very well. It's going to be much easier for them to ensure the installation is correct. UAT, on the other hand, is a little tricky. While a lot of vendors offer test scripts for UAT, and these can be a great tool, you want to keep in mind that the goal of a UAT is to make sure that the system is fit for use in your environment and your users. So that may or may not match up to what the vendor has in a set of canned scripts. So it's a good idea to review their scripts and determine if they are sufficient for your use. You'll probably find that some are, and some need to be modified or challenge tests added for a specific user requirement. In the end, because it is a user acceptance test, you want to make sure that users are executing the tests. It also helps them to learn, and not the vendor. It's okay to have a vendor present and support the testing, but they cannot really verify that it's acceptable for your use at your company. Some more questions. How often do I need to revalidate a lab system? I have a LIMS that has been used for several years. It's initially validated but hasn't been revalidated since. Do I need to revalidate? It depends a lot on the quality of your change control system. There's nothing that really says you absolutely must revalidate every year or every 2 years. What the regulations do say and require is that you maintain the validated state. So if you implemented your system and you haven't made a single change to this system in 7 years, then there's no need to revalidate. Or if you made some changes, but you have a very mature change control system, you're sure that you haven't compromised the system, well then there's also no need to revalidate. Most companies fall somewhere in the middle. They're making changes or using change control, but sometimes things do slip through the cracks, and oftentimes they're changes to the intended use of the system, but they haven't been captured in change control. So businesses aren't static, and we know that, and it's more than likely that over 7 years of your intended use that the system may have changed. So if that didn't require a system change, that you may or not have captured any change control. So if that's the case, periodic review is a good place to check and to see if your user requirements are still up to date or if your supporting procedures are still up to date. It's also an opportunity to compare your configuration to the change control documents and to see where there might be some gaps. The outcome of that periodic review is then a determination of what, if any, revalidation may be required. Usually what we'll find is there is some revalidation needed, but it would be unusual to require complete system revalidation if you're using change control and configuration management. Ashley, you want to take a shot at the next one?
Yeah, so the next question is there a GXP equivalent to the BAA for HIPAA? So the BAA, for those that don't know, is the Business Associate Agreement. And what that is it's the regulatory requirement that I mentioned a few slides back about having a contract in place that says if you are doing business with, for, on behalf of a HIPAA regulated company, that you will also comply with the same regulations. There really is not a GXP equivalent. The closest thing that I would say is a quality agreement. A quality agreement does the same thing. It says, you know, you're going to follow the regulations, you're going to follow our quality processes, and kind of here's what we have agreed to as to what those regulations and quality processes are. But a quality agreement is not required by the FDA. I think, you know, most pharmaceutical companies do utilize them when they're outsourcing things, but it's not required. And also, one of the things that we see in FDA-regulated industry is that if you are, you know, making an API, which is when you typically have a QA in place, QA being quality agreement, not to be confused with QA quality assurance, but if you have a quality agreement in place, you're making an API, the FDA can come audit you and inspect you just as they would the maker of the finished product.
Okay, so we have another question here. How do I validate a system that has SOX, HIPAA, and GMP implications? The overall validation process shouldn't change based on having regulated by one of these or all three. Your user requirements are going to be they're going to vary a lot. So what you'll want to do is make sure that you have all the relevant parties involved and that there are no conflicting requirements, particularly when you're looking at security and audit trails. You know, those are important. You know, your finance office and your privacy office, you know, they may have different ideas of what's required. So engage them early and ensure that you get their buy-in on one single consistent set of user requirements, and then build your risk assessment and testing strategy from that point on. There's another question.
Yeah, who is responsible for approving the validation report of a financial system? At the very minimum, that's going to be your compliance officer from a finance perspective. You may or may not have somebody that has that title, but there should be somebody in your company that is designated with that role of compliance officer. And beyond that, it's going to depend, you know, largely on your internal procedures. Typically, you're not going to have a system that only one person signs off on the report. So I'm assuming that the question if this is coming largely from the compliance arena. But also, you know, you're going to have somebody that is responsible for the technical content that you're going to want to sign off, and you're going to want to have somebody from a functional business side that you want to sign off that it's met your needs.
Okay. Next question. How long should it take to validate an ERP? Obviously, very loaded question. There isn't really a straightforward answer to this, and it does vary a lot with the complexity and intended use of your ERP. If you've tuned into one of our webcasts before, you've probably heard many times that validation is nothing more than well-documented good practice. So if you have a strong project management methodology portfolio, the additional work for validation shouldn't be much. It should be minimal. If your project is not managed well, the overhead for validation will be much higher, and it's going to increase as risk goes up. That may be risk from a high degree of customization, or risk because of a high risk to product quality and or patient safety. As a general rule, we'd expect the validation effort to be in a range of 10 to 20% of your total project implementation, and that's, again, based on time and budget. But again, it is a lot of variability in this, so, but very good question. That's the end of this webcast, and we would like to hear from you about what you thought And in particular, if you have any questions, I'd also like to point out that the list of our webcasts in this series, which is on the screen right now, B&D is a global consultancy, and we work with projects and programs in any part of the world, including training in any of the subjects that we have expertise. It doesn't mean having to engage a consultant full-time. We offer compliance as a service package where clients who require occasional help can reserve a certain amount of time per month from one of B&D's consultants and use it on-site, off-site, a few hours each month, or save it up for a longer project later. It's very flexible. If you're interested, ask us for some information, and we'll send you a sheet on it and how it works. Of course, we also do full implementations in large companies for complex projects that do require a full-time team, and we can provide everything from a full-time project manager to technical writers for short periods. Typically, this is for projects such as Oracle E-Business Suite, SAP, and other ERP systems or other similar large, complex, configurable systems. No question is too small, and we always reply. The email address and web page to get in touch are at the bottom of the screen, together with the phone number of the B&D North American office. On your behalf, I'd like to thank Ashley for preparing and presenting today with me, and on behalf of Business and Decision, I'd like to thank each of you for attending. We hope you'll join us again in the near future.